Welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module called Marx on India, which comes under the paper Classical Sociological Theory. Marx, as we know, was one of the dominant or leading theoreticians during the early 19th century till the mid 19th century. His works that used a materialist understanding to comprehend the changes that took place in human history made him famous. His critical analysis of the conflicts that emerged in different phases of human civilization's development also provided an insight into how capitalism emerged in Europe. One of the reasons for capitalism to emerge in Europe was the surplus value that was accumulated through colonialism. Now, Marx viewed colonialism as a necessary fact or a necessary stage in the development of capitalism in India, and he foresaw that in India also at one point of time there would be a huge revolution through the working class movements. Absence of private property in land. History has made it pretty clear that Karl Marx never came to India, but he has put down something about India in his writings. Karl Marx only read the works of historians who had visited India and come up with various ethnographies and various theories in the Asiatic mode of production. He first built up the Oriental conception of the absence of the private property in land and later applied it to India. To all these, Karl Marx enunciated in the case of India that property exists only as a communal property. According to this theory, the individual member is as such only a possessor of a particular part, hereditary or not, since any fraction of the property belongs to no member for himself, but to him only as immediate member of the commune. The individual is thus only a possessor. What exists is only communal property and only private possession. To be more specific, Marx relied solely on the works of Bernier, Mills and Jones, and also on British colonial administrators and their ethnographies such as Mayne, Elphinstone, Campbell, and as far as the issues of non-existence of private property in land in the Oriental social formation is concerned. If one goes through some of the writings of Karl Marx, one can deduce that he exhibits abundantly that private ownership in land in the pre-colonial Indian social formation did not exist. In fact, this becomes evident when he says that it was the British who introduced in India the institution of private property. Other forms of communal ownership. Apart from the Asiatic and Slavonic forms of ownership which Marx applied to India, he talked about two other forms of communal ownership. These were the Roman and the Germanic. According to the Asiatic form, in both Roman and Germanic forms, there were individual properties alongside the communal property. For example, in the Germanic form, the communal property appears only as a complement to individual property, with the latter as the base, while the commune has no existence for itself except in the assembly of the commune members. They are coming together for the common purposes. Whereas in the Roman form, on the other hand, property appears to exist in the double form of state and private property alongside one another. In his letter to angels, he writes that in the Roman form, the land is occupied by the commune, Roman land a part remains to the commune as such as distinct from the commune members. The publicus in its various forms. The other part is divided up, and each parcel of land is Roman by virtue of being a private property, the domain of a Roman, the part of laboratorium belonging to him, but also he is a Roman only insofar as he possesses the sovereign right over a part of the Roman earth. Reasons for communal ownership of land. The reason as to why the Orientals and the Indian, in our case, never arrived at private property, according to Marx, brewed up from different realms. His explanation, falling angels, was climatic or geographical in the main. Since artificial irrigation constituted one of the bases of agriculture in the arid or semi-arid regions of India, economical and common use of water necessitated intervention of the centralizing authority of the state. The state intervened in view of the absence of private or voluntary association, because of the existence of the low level of civilization and the too vast extent of territories. This, to Karl Marx, was the reason as to why one cannot talk about the existence of private ownership in pre-colonial India. Social stagnation and village community. Karl Marx powerfully posits that the village communities in the Indian context were characterized by an inextricable unity of agriculture and handicrafts. Such unique dual combination of agriculture and handicrafts provided the village communities with such self-sufficiency and enough necessary for their simple reproduction and tenacious existence, that, as Bhulabhadra puts it, they were locked within their independent organization and distinct life. As per the situation of the industry, not as in the modern sense of the word, in the village communities, there was a natural division of labor, not as we see in the capitalist mode of production. The form of division of labor that existed in the economically self-sufficient village economies or communities of India presented a very different picture. In this form of division of labor, the individuals remain connected in the making of certain products, but this did not involve separate operations in making each product. Marx describes such a primitive society based on property in common. Despotism in India. Another view that Marx established about India was that of despotism. He extracted the views of Robert Patten and Richard Jones, who had earlier posited a thesis that because of the non-existence of a landed aristocracy as a political counterweight, the sovereign's power is the absolutely unrestricted power. According to Patten, the immense extension of the country as far back as history can reach, perpetual sovereignties have existed with undiminished power and splendor, without the occurrence of any degree whatever of limitation, alteration, or restraint. Nowhere would one find any allusions by Karl Marx as to the factual abuse of political power by state officials. He, with Jones and others, considered that ownership belonged to the state and that, by implication, no privileged landed proprietors existed as contenders to the political power in pre-colonial India. The result of all this was despotism, he says. He goes ahead to assert that in pre-colonial Indian social formation, despotism and propertylessness seems legally to exist. So one can confirm here that the sovereignty in India consists in land ownership. The other reason for the existence of despotism was the existence and the effects of the idyllic village communities. These village communities, along with the absence of private landed property, provided solid foundations for the reality of despotism. What Karl Marx found most objectionable about these village communities was their closed nature, which in turn produced no possibility of internal social change or political development. The great Oriental reality Marx narrows down to the Indian context. Feudalism in India. If we read critically into the writings of Karl Marx about India, we realize that he kind of does not really affirm the development of feudalism in India. But if he is quite clear with this concept when it comes to Europe, but not when it comes to India. But in the writings of other historians, India had definitely passed through a feudal phase. Bhulabhadra in his thesis posits that Indian feudalism did not emphasize the economic contract to the same degree as certain types of European feudalism, but the difference is not so significant as to preclude the use of the term feudalism for conditions prevailing in India during the period. The basic prerequisites of a feudal system were present in India. One thing worth of note about feudalism in India, as Bhulabhadra puts it, is that feudal developments in medieval India were uneven, just as no part of Europe was ever completely feudalized. Furthermore, it is needless to point out that certain economic and political, juridical and social developments that occurred in medieval India were designed here as feudal precisely because they were strikingly resembling similar developments in European feudalisms. For this reason, such feudal developments completely negate Marx's Asiatic mode of production, particularly in its assertion of the absence of property in India. Economic determinism in India. No one would deny the fact that the economic factors have largely influenced history. Before everything, man must live, must find food and clothing and shelter, but man does not live on bread alone. Karl Marx, in his materialist interpretation of history, places production, which is an economic activity, at the center of the historical process. Determining the whole historical development fabric as economical is problematic. Not all the societies that sprang up in history were backed by economics. Looking at things from the perspective, one can confirm without any fear or favor that India had a unique history, and what India is today is built up of different factors. Economic, though, must have played a very important role to shape its history. Alienation of Indians in the colonial. Karl Marx may see that colonialism was inevitable for India in a way forward to taking India to another level of development. But colonialism had alienated the Indians from their own homeland. It created in Indians hatred for the British. We talk about today of modern India as an emerging economy, but the alienation it suffered in the past from the hands of the colonialist cannot be overlooked. This is because in alienation, as Marx himself puts it, humans become debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable beings whose life activity becomes a mere means of existence. So colonialism, I would say, really caused harm to India in this sense. The Indian Marxists and colonialism, or the class struggle. Pam Datta in his book India Today makes mention of the fact that colonialism had resulted in the growth of the notion of class consciousness, which was expressed in the nationalist struggle for independence by Mahatma Gandhi and his colleagues. Karl Marx establishes in the Communist Manifesto that the history of every society is hitherto the history of class struggle. One will agree with him that many societies have in history experienced tension between the privileged and the underprivileged. But if class struggle has always occurred, they do not explain all the events of history. In the case of India, the ravaging effects of colonial rule and exploitation left the Indian proletariat with no choice than to tackle their bourgeoisie British counterpart. But it is good to note here that the Indian Marxists did build a platform from where history is moving from one stage to another, as we shall see in the European categories. The Indian situation was liberation, freedom and integration. Challenge to the Indian Marxists. After more than 5 decades of independence, India has got a big number of rural, urban poor. After the dismissal of the grand bourgeoisie, the British from India, the Indian bourgeoisie emerged. According to Prakash Karat, at the 20th anniversary meeting of Marx Badi Path of 26th August 2000, India is still experiencing landlordism, which was a feudal practice. Marxism had not yet solved the unique Indian problems. The big urban and petty rural bourgeoisie still hold others in captive. There is a caste system soaked in class consciousness. Now, has there been anywhere forward? Have the Indian Marxists been able to foster a powerful revolution of the workers, poor peasants and agricultural labor? To some extent, yes, but to a large extent, no. The views of Karl Marx sound so utopian to unique, multifaceted India, which is multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious. It should be borne in the minds of the Indian Marxists that organizing a revolution in India is not easy. When the British have been criticized for holding India captive for more than 2 centuries, another question that arises is, have the Indians acted differently from the British? Have they not subjugated their own? Have the Marxists been able to eradicate capitalism? These are the questions that are debatable, but they are fundamental too for the Marxists to answer. Now, other questions the Marxists should bear in mind is, if there is a successful revolution someday, will subjugation cease to exist? Will gender problems be over? And will the caste system be washed away? At the surface level, the ideas of Karl Marx sound sweet, but at the practical level, it's very difficult to implement. And the whole system which Marx envisaged worked only in favor of a few contexts. Some of the Asian countries that practice communism did not follow the trend which Karl Marx posits in his historical process. They took a different line altogether. The Indian Marxists may have to bear the fact that one cannot overlook what the British did for India. An overview, summing up, the ideas of Karl Marx on Indian society are too complex to be totally rejected or totally accepted. There are a lot to be said for and against Marxist views. Those who adopted his thoughts interpret him differently. Karl Marx genuinely, from the outset, was to trace human history, how it developed, and the different stages and difficulties that humans have passed through. Also, his intention was to produce an empirical work by considering the development of economic structure of society as a natural historical process, and by studying the social antagonisms which arise from the natural law of production. The mode of production of material life for Karl Marx determines the general character of the social, political and spiritual process of life. But with so much stress on the material life on humans, his theory was greatly weakened. This is because there is more to humans than just being mere material beings possessing material needs. To finally conclude, this particular module gave us a fair idea of Marx's hope that India would very soon emerge an important place where the proletariat movement would gain momentum, and he believed that colonialism in India was just a stage set necessary for India to emerge into capitalism. These thoughts, of course, were later taken up by Indian Marxists, who debated whether Marx's understanding of the Indian situation was indeed very accurate or not. But for one, Marx's understanding of Indian society enabled later Indian Marxists to develop their own kinds of theories to understand Indian society.